I want to be sure to speak as briefly as possible because it's going to be interesting to hear what those in the room have to say, but I have a few problems. First of all, I didn't know until listening to Trilling that he was being paid $100 for a 2-line poem. I wrote in 2014 more than 20,000 words, and I haven't received a dime. So then Juan implicitly faulted the nation for doing something before I was born, I think, in delaying judgment. But I'm sure the Nation editors took the Chinese long view of history. You remember when Chow Lai went to France for the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. No, Eric Cohen will remember this. Premier Chow got off the plane, and the French reporters said to him, "What do you think are the consequences of the French Revolution?" And Chow said, "It's too early to judge." And then I got a problem with my wife's introduction. When I used to work for CBS News many years ago, I found myself in Malta conference, standing beside CBS's lead foreign correspondent, and she was to go on live, and I was to follow her. And she said to me, "Steve, what are you going to say?" And I said, "Well, watching these guys, Gorbachev and Bush, unable to get to each other's ships because of the stormy seas, I'm going to say, all the best laid plans of mice and men, they can't get to the ships, can they really, in the Cold War?" She goes on first, and she begins like this: "All the best laid plans of mice and men," and there I'm standing like a moron with a live mic. Well, the other night on New Year's Eve, my wife pretended to have more to drink than she did, and said to me, "What are you going to say?" And I told her, and then she said it in her introduction. So I can be a little quicker than I need to be. I have spoken at a lot of scholarly conferences, panels, but I'm going to do so more personally than I ever did before, not because I've been married to the current, as one of the Vladmir Putins, the current editor and publisher for nearly 3 decades, because of circumstances. I didn't come to the Nation, as many people did, through old or new left politics. Truth be told, I'm actually not much of a lefty on land or on sea. I grew up in a small segregated town in Kentucky, where I don't recall ever seeing not only the Nation, but any magazines. The local magazine shop mainly had Mike Hammer displaying novels. Basketball news, the racing news, and once a week the local Courier Journal came down. I then went to Indiana University in Bloomington, 120 miles across the river, and I do remember seeing the Nation magazine in the bookstore occasionally, but actually, to tell you the truth, I don't remember reading much of anything in college. Mainly I worked on my golf game and my pool game, and kind of gained the system as possible and got through. When I came to New York in the 60s to get my PhD at Columbia, I did read the Nation occasionally, but now I was in a fact-driven mode. I needed information, and the first magazine I ever subscribed to, and did so until it vanished, was The New Leader, because its contributors on Russia were the Mensheviks, who had found refuge in New York, in Germany, and elsewhere, and they were arguing everything that had happened in Russia since 1917. And since that was my period, it was useful. You might remember that it was the New Republic that published the pamphlet with Khrushchev's speech. Now it's Stalin, the new leader. Excuse me. So I was in a factological mode in need of information, not really opinion. It was only in the 70s, as a Princeton professor, when I began writing occasionally for the New York Times, quite a bit actually, in the various sections of the paper, that I felt myself with a really strong urge. And I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing for a professor, but it happens, to reach an audience broader than my academic colleagues and the 5,000 people who seem to buy every hardcover book I ever published in that day. Nobody ever knew, my publisher, why it was only 5,000, not more nor less. Some of them must have died. I don't know, maybe the children become what happened. But I felt, because of the Cold War, the need to write more broadly. Believe it or not, considering that I'm virtually blacklisted at the New York Times today, in 1975 or 1976, the New York Times invited me to become one of its 2 permanent correspondents in Moscow, to leave the university. I worked at the time. very close to doing so, except that family problems emerged, and I didn't. But that gave rise to my idea of something that I then called, in my mind and in my life, took the expression scholarly journalism. Was it possible to do this? I think I was influenced. I had lived in England as a very, very young man, 18, 19 years old, and I had read the Observer, a weekly newspaper, and it had every week a column called Inside Russia by a man named Edward Crenshaw, who, though not an academic, really had an academic way of thinking and the requisite knowledge. And I was very impressed every week by that column. I knew nothing comparable in the English speaking world. And it fixed in my mind, could I find a place for this? And I had met at Princeton, I think, when he was visiting Professor Victor Lasky. So I spin this idea to Victor, not only me, but to others. And he embraced it, and thus was born this column that I wrote in the 80s, monthly, called Sovietics. In my mind, I thought of it as scholarly journalism. I wrote for the Nation then, as I do now, and I think as Juan and Greg and others do. Though we are performing as journalists, nonetheless we write as scholars. We do nothing to offend what we think is our scholarly credentials based on lots of years of research. So the trick is finding a way to take that scholarly knowledge and make it accessible in an idiom and at a length in a weekly magazine, whether it's The Nation or elsewhere, that you reach a large audience. For me, that meant three elements had to be there. I had to report information not generally available in the press, and that's what scholars call original research, empirical research. I had to avoid factual errors. That is, I actually kept a file for every column of sources and documentation, just as I do when I write a chapter or a part of a chapter of a scholarly book. It meant not making mistakes. And it meant providing analysis or perspective or interpretation or conclusions, because I was now in the realm of American foreign policy as well, that I thought were contrary to or unlike the ones in the mainstream press. I was seeking influence of some kind. The Nation was the perfect place to do this. I don't know about I did write for other magazines, but I never had quite the same experience as it offered. It was the perfect place for scholarly journalism. I was given roughly 935 words a column. It took a while, but I assure you that the 10,000-word article you send to the American Historical Review, the American Journal, you can get in the 9 to go, you can. My wife laughs. She laughs when she's nervous. She's wondering what we're getting her. But the reality is you can do it if you have a mind to do it. Probably Juan more so because he logs and knows how to do it better. It took a while, but it can be done. It can be done. And that's good in itself. But the 950 words was I couldn't go over and I couldn't do that. Secondly, every word or sentence, generalization I wrote was fact-checked by a band of zealous Nation interns who live for finding errors made by them adults. That's more important than politics or sex or drugs or anything. That's their high. So that's good. And they did find some errors. They did find errors. And no one in the Nation, Trina was not the editor, Victor was, no one ever tried to influence what I wrote or what I did not write, even though the Nation was publishing articles at the time with diametrically, I would say, perspectives, conflicting perspectives between my own, including those of Alexander Cohen, for example, who couldn't think of anything Stalin had done that hadn't been about right, necessity. And I came from a different tradition and perspective. And that was perfectly okay. I didn't mind, but I was left alone. The column, of course, diminishes, I guess, Juan, the quantity of your traditional scholarly writing, at least it certainly did in my case. I couldn't do both at the same pace. But it was a success for me, and I was grateful to the Nation, where I had not been a regular contributor before. I think I put a piece there in 1979, some odd hits before the column began in 82, but it was fairly successful. It was actually syndicated, but there was no wire at the Nation, no syndicator. I took 40 copies, Xerox copies of the column, the night I finished it, to the post office and dropped it into 15 newspapers I thought might be interested, and usually 13 or 14 a month published it. I made some money. I gained some influence in policy in larger political circles, and the nation even went out and lobbied and got me a journalistic award. I don't remember the name of it, but I thought I'd never really won an academic award, and this was really quite a nice thing. But since the column, and with it the Soviet Union in it, my nation writing has changed fundamentally. And I took on what I call the new mission, along with the old mission. The old mission of scholarly journalism had been to act on the adage, which Trina brought to me again, that journalism should be a first draft of history, if it's any good. It may be a kind of vanity, but it's not a bad aspiration. And those of us who turn to newspapers of the period that we're researching know that there is stuff there that needs to be cited, and stuff you wonder why it ever appeared. Until the early 1990s, the mainstream American establishment press, and the two that mattered on Russia, were the New York Times and Washington Post. The Wall Street Journal occasionally. Those two newspapers printed credible first drafts of history till 1994. My writing, my drafts of history were different, but they were compatible. They were not at war with each other. But ever since the early 1990s, in my judgment, and I will speak candidly now, most of what the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have printed in their news reports, in their editorials, and on their op-ed pages is journalistic malpractice in its coverage of Russia. Malpractice. It is often ideological, but where they get this ideology is a bit of a puzzle, but they've got it. It's often not factual. I have a carton of factual errors that I clip and underline and throw in a carton, and that means it's a good carton now. And it's usually one-dimensional. They tell part of the story. And it's made to fit into an orthodox narrative, which more often than not is the narrative of the White House itself. In a word, those papers summarize 2 decades. In a word, it's more complicated. Idealize Yeltsin's leadership of Russia in the 1990s and have demonized Putin's leadership of Russia ever since. That's about what it comes down to. And everything's been made to fit into that perspective. Therefore, I had to change if I was going to continue to write for the nation or any place else that would have me. By then, it was almost only the nation. So I began now writing more long-form pieces, 3,000, 4,000. I think I once stepped over 6,000 words. But I wanted to include with my first drafts of history something that pretty much has vanished in America: media criticism. Used to be people who weekly wrote about the media. I wanted to include it. And again, the nation gave you space and freedom, and even more of the extra fact checking. So different now, and sharp, for the perspective I was presenting in the nation, in the mainstream, that essentially when my writings of the 90s were reprinted in a book that I published in 2000 called Failed Crusade, I was banished from the mainstream press. I remain so today. I can't get in those papers any longer, even though I was a fairly regular contributor there before. Got a lot of nerve. Last year, in 2014, you can't expect me to finish that time of year, but get this in my ear anyway. For me and for the nation on Russia, things changed more fundamentally. 2014 last year. Until a year ago, I had pretty much gone back to my historical research. I needed to do a lot of work in the recently accessible Soviet-era archives in Moscow for the book I was going to write. But the unfolding American-Russian confrontation over Ukraine drew me back in. I felt like a character in The Godfather just as I get out, they pull me back in. Because I was done with this. I've gotten old, become a senior citizen, in politically correct language. And I, TR, time remaining, I need those archives. Sure. But in 2010, in addition to, in 2014, in addition to some co-signed editorials with Katrina Vanden Heuvel, I wrote a series of long, sharply dissenting articles, even more critical of mainstream coverage and U.S. policy than those I had written earlier. In short, I'll sum up what the essence of what I wrote was. I argued that a Western-imposed political dispute in Kiev in November 2013 about whether or not Kiev would sign the exclusive trade agreement with the European Union had triggered a Ukrainian civil war. And the civil war had become an American-Russian proxy war. And that had become today's exceedingly dangerous new Cold War. While the mainstream press, like the White House, attributes all of this to, quote, Putin's aggression or Russia's aggression, I, in the American tradition of there are two sides to every story, tried to present Russia's view of this, and concluded at the end that throughout, without an exception, Putin's behavior as leader of Russia has been and remains today primarily reactive. I made it historical. I said this story begins at least in the 1990s. Because in the media today, the Ukrainian crisis began yesterday. But it didn't. And I wasn't alone at the Nation or on its website. Katrina's leadership of the magazine, and this is what a great editor does, attracted by example and went out and recruited new writers, considerably younger than I am, who also began to write for the Nation these alternative first drafts of history. I have in mind Nikolai Petro, a young professor at the University of Rhode Island, Alec Loon, who has been performing as a correspondent in Russia and in Donbass, who was just recently an intern, James Carden, who Katrina snatched from the American Conservative of all places, and a 25-year-old graduate student at the University of Michigan, Petro Shakarian, who knows more than any of us. He's simply a phenomenon, and one's going to look him up when he gets back out there. As a result, I think it's not boastful to say that no other comparable American publication has provided readers with such alternative accounts and perspectives on this truly radical turning point in history that we are living through, at least since 2015. This has been done at a small price. But not only but I have been denounced, I would say, defamed and libeled in liberal and conservative publications alike, including the New Republic most frequently, as, quote, Putin's #1 American apologist, dupe, useful idiot, and token. But, as unpleasant as this is, it is no price at all to pay to do what's necessary. I am fairly certain, and I speak not only what I've contributed to the Nation, but to the group that Katrina has brought to it and continues to bring to it, younger people. Looking back on the fateful events of 2014, and I don't think our media, I don't think our president, I don't think our Congress are aware of how fateful these events are. Everything is changing in the world. I think historians will certainly cite the Nation as a source. And I think they will wonder why, and I wrote this sentence very carefully, why the mainstream American press, including or especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, have throughout printed misinformation, scarcely less slanted, selective, and unconfirmed than what pours out of Moscow and Kiev every day. I would be hard put to tell you which is generating more information. Well, I know Kiev. But after that is Moscow, got it wrong more than Washington and America, I don't know. The Nation, therefore, has given millions of readers, because of the website, but I don't know how it works, but eventually millions of people see what's in the magazine. What's necessary? An alternative, fact-based, dissenting first draft of this history. Unfortunately, it's either not read or not understood by the American Congress, which last month voted almost unanimously a resolution of Cold War and implicitly in the language, hot war against Russia. We did this in December. Those bills, now signed by President Obama, include innumerable assertions that would never pass a first check by 20-year-old Nation fact checkers. It is simply a scandal. And the Nation, so far as I know, I mean, there are things on the website, is alone in the print media that can still reach into the mainstream or ramify there. So I can't speak about what happened before I was born and when I was living in Kentucky. But certainly in recent times, I think it's fair to say, paraphrase Madeleine Albright, the Nation really has been